Okay, this is week 16 in a 16-week course. So, you know what that means, don't you? Yeah, it's time for the final exam. Okay, so let's just go through this because the rules really haven't changed since we did the midterm. It's going to be the second half of the course, chapters 8 through 14, kind of straightforward. Yes, I've provided this video exam, plus I'm going to go over the topics that may appear on the exam. I do want you to study for the exam. These things are worth an awful lot of points, so yeah. And when you're done, do that very last journal. The very last journal is going to ask you some questions like, you know, what did you like about the course? What did you not like about the course? Things of that nature. Okay, and just as a reminder, I have to turn your grades in the following Monday morning. So there is no opportunity for any late. There's no late fees. If you don't get your final exam in on time, you get a 0 for that spot, and I turn your grades in as is. So there's no late fees for this one particular time. Okay, kind of makes sense? All right, let's go over the rules. The rules basically haven't changed, so I'm just going to click here to fire these little guys up. I'm going to go ahead and go to the notepad version of this. So, one more time. So this is the final exam, and it covers the second half of the course. It's open book, open notes, open internet, open everything. I don't care. There's going to be 40 questions in a pool, but you're not going to get 40. You're going to get 25 out of that pool. And in addition to the 25 randomly selected ones, you're also going to get 2 extra credit questions that everyone gets. So I don't really know the order in which these things, I mean, I do give you the chapter and page number, but that doesn't mean that's the order these things are going to appear. In fact, not at all likely they're going to be in this order. So, for example, spanning. I may have a question on, you know, difference between column spanning and row spanning. And so I give you the chapter and page number to go in and look this thing up. But to tell you the truth, you really kind of need to know this stuff because this is a timed quiz. I mean, an hour and 15 minutes, that doesn't give you much time to look things up. So you really, really need to study. Okay, so as always, a no in this book column basically means it either wasn't covered adequately or not covered at all. And then, you know, as always, 20% of the material is from lecture and not in the book. Okay, so the very first one, and we need to talk about, and that is things have changed. When last time I taught this course, which was like last semester or so, when you did validation, it was perfectly okay, for example, to have the border attribute in a table. Things have changed. The new validation rules basically say now that's not the case. So I have gone through and amended my previous chapter notes from chapter 8. I've actually gone through and amended the video to tell what the new answer is. So I'm telling you that because if you just studied the old material, you're not going to do well. You need to know what the latest and greatest material is. So I'm amending the notes and amending the videos, and I'm going to ask you questions based upon the current version of HTML. The next one talks about the table header. If you recall, there's 2 different ways you can have, you know, a row. You can have just a traditional row with normal data in it, or you could have a row that has those little headers, the THs. And so what's different about the THs? Is anything going on there? Something different? What is it? You know, where can it be applied? Those are good questions. Spanning. Spanning is kind of complicated because of the concept of horizontal and vertical may not make as much sense as you might think. If I want to combine 2 things vertically, is that a column span or is that a row span? Yeah, it's a little confusing. So yeah, you're going to have to know a little bit about that. The next one talks about like the table CSS stuff. What kind of things can you do in a table with CSS? It's kind of be straightforward. I don't think it'll be a real problem. Remember the pseudo classes? We had a lot of pseudo classes. One of the pseudo classes that we talked about was that nth of type. Remember that? It was the guy that we used for doing like alternate rows. I mean, you can use it for lots of other things, but in this particular example, That's an example of a good pseudo class that was kind of sort of invented for tables in mind, although you can certainly use it for other things. So pseudo classes. Table sections. You guys remember there's a T head and a T body and a T foot and all that? Okay, good. I ask you some questions about that. So now we're already on the chapter 9, talking about forms. So we had a question that was kind of in one of the previous quizzes that talked about if you have a submit button and you click on it, where is the action? Where is the thing that gets launched? You know, the JavaScript or the HTML hyperlink, you know, where are those things stored? Are they stored in the button? Are they stored someplace on the form? That kind of stuff. That's the kind of basic questions I'm going to ask you, is where things are. So this is kind of a basic question on where can I find this, where can I find that kind of thing. When talking about forms, we have the ID and the name attributes, and they're almost always the same. And there may be a question there talking about, you know, why is that, or which one is used. You know, what uses the ID and what uses the name and why and what's the difference and blah 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 blah. You know, which one is used for CS, which one is used for back-end processing, that kind of stuff. The submit button. If you recall, almost all the form elements in here have a value, and the value is what gets transmitted with the, you know, with the form when you do something to it. You know, the value name pair. So yeah, I'm going to ask you some questions about the value of text things in the submit button. The next one is the reset button. It could be a simple question like, what the heck does it do? It could be a very specific question. It talks about, what about things that have default values? I mean, when I do a reset, does it clear the ones, or does it pre-populate them with the defaults, or, you know, what does it actually do? That'd be a good question. Radio buttons, we've talked about this a bunch, but basically when you want to have two sets of radio buttons operating independently, you got to do something. So what is it you have to do to make that happen? That would be a good question. Or maybe just a simple question on what the heck's the difference between a radio button and a checkbox. Keyboard shortcuts. In forms, it's sometimes a little easier, particularly with accessibility in mind, to be able to navigate through a form by just using like the tab key or keyboard shortcuts, where you can say, you know, Alt F to go to first name and Alt L to go to last name, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to ask you some questions about how do you do that? You know, there's got to be some sort of an attribute or something in that control that says, here's how I attach a keyboard shortcut. Cool? Alrighty. Now we're into Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is talking about Agile. Agile is an alternative to the SDLC. It's not used everywhere. It's not necessarily appropriate everywhere. But I might ask you a question about where it is appropriate, or I might ask you a question where it is not appropriate. So you need to be able to talk about the difference between using the traditional SDLC versus Agile. Either for or against be a good question. Web hosting. We talked about 3 or 4 different ways you can do web hosting, and one of which, of course, is do it yourself. You know, you're a big company, so you got an extra server over there in the server room, and you say that's going to be my web server, and so you do it yourself. You're responsible for the hardware and all the servers and the patches and everything. Or the exact opposite of that, which is a complete turnkey system where you're not involved with the maintenance, you're not involved with a server, you don't even know what the hardware is. You just pay every month, probably dirt cheap, pay every month, and somebody else takes care of all that. And then there's some things in between. So yeah, we're going to be asking you some questions about what's best and why. You know, why would a small business want to do this? Or why would a large business want to do that? Those kind of, be able to defend those decisions. That's what that question is going to be about. The next couple of these have pluses next to them because I'm talking about the particular phases of the web development cycle. So I didn't put the actual page numbers there. I just started. So the first one's going to be basically, I kind of like the idea of having some of the phases in the development cycle be able to answer questions. So what are those questions? That would be a good one. And then a lot of this stuff is going to be like, explain to me what feasibility analysis is or does, or how does it fit in there? Why do we have to do that in the order in which it's being done? Likewise with page layout, there's going to be some decisions you need to make. Is this going to be a 2-column or a 3-column or a free-flowing or whatever? So I'm going to ask you, like, why is it here? Or what choices do I have? And why is it before that or after this? Those kind of things. Unit testing. You guys remember the difference between unit testing and all the other testing types? I mean, there's integration testing, and there's application testing, and there's an entire section of the life cycle talking about testing. So where does unit testing fit into this? Excuse me. Java plugin. We've talked about this in the previous chapters, and it's okay, but the Java plugin's going away. You guys just wrote a paper on this, and so you probably should know an awful lot about this by now. In fact, that should be a very easy one if you wrote your paper. No trouble at all. I'm going to ask you some questions about Microsoft Edge. And if you're not a Windows 10 person and you don't use Microsoft Edge, that's okay. I've described it well enough. If you were taking notes, you don't have to be running it to be able to answer this question. But I am going to ask you some questions about, how well does it support, all these HTML5 things, that kind of stuff. Okay, the next one talks about the audio and video hyperlinks. If you recall, like when you put audio or video, you want to use an MPEG-4 or an OGG or whatever, and then at the very end, if they can't handle any of that, then you just throw a hyperlink at them and let them figure it out. Whatever they got at their end that can handle it. So I'm going to ask you some questions about those hyperlinks. Why, for example, like why is it the last resort, or what happens if somebody doesn't have any codecs at all on their machine and you hit this line? What's going to appear on the screen? That would be a good question. Kind of sort of similar to that is the audio element, the next one. I'm going to ask you some questions about, plugins versus codecs. That would be a good question. What's the difference between the two, and why do I need one versus the other? And are the multimedia wars actually over, or have they just kind of changed complexion and kept on going? That would be a good question. The next one talks about copyright. If you recall from some of the discussions, practically everything that's on the web is already copyrighted. They don't have to say that it's copyrighted. They don't have to do anything. They just audit, because it's considered published work. It's all copyrighted. Now, there are some ways you can get around. There is a whole thing called the fair use. So I'm going to ask you some questions about, like, how does fair use fit into this, and how does it all work? Okay. Continuing, multimedia accessibility. So this whole chapter is about multimedia. So now I'm going to be talking about what do I have to do in order to have a video or an audio online in order to make it accessible. There's got to be something that needs to be done to make that happen. Okay. Next, in chapter 12, they talk about the customer reluctance. I may ask you to recall a story that I tell about some people who don't want to send their credit card over the web, and so they call somebody on the phone at a call center and give them their credit card number over the phone. I may ask you some questions about how relevant that is. Okay, this is a good place to start for the 15-minute mark, and we can polish this thing off in just a few more minutes.